I'd like to, on behalf of Mind and Life, as a moderator and board member, to welcome everyone here, the Mind and Life family and our Tibetan friends, and I particularly want to acknowledge the monks who have come from monasteries all over India, and of course we'll have a special session at the end of each day for questions and clarifications and debate and so on with the monks. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mind and Life, this is an unusual organization. It was founded by two visionaries, Francisco Varela, the late Francisco Varela, who was an amazing cognitive neuroscientist, very visionary, and a visionary businessman, Adam Engel. It started as a series of small dialogues and has grown now to really flourish into programs for graduate students and fellowships, and please read about it in the brochure. I first came to Mind and Life in 1989. It was the second meeting. This is the 23rd now. And in the second meeting was in Newport Beach, you may remember, because just at that time you won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I remember very well the press conference that you had for the Peace Prize, and the first question that was asked, which was, how do you feel winning the Peace Prize? And your answer has stayed with me to this day. It was, I feel very happy for my friends who wanted me to win the prize. That was when I first got the understanding that you were a very unusual person. I also later came to...
Yes.
And later, of course, I came to understand that that was an expression of mudita, altruistic joy, taking pleasure in the joy of happiness of other people. I would like to ask...
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, Your Holiness, would you care to welcome people on your behalf?
당연히 인지 창조를 좀 창조 근데 오래. 경례 왜? Once more, we have this gathering. And number of you, we're quite familiar. And then also new faces also are here. Most welcome. I think last year in Delhi, after my sort of interview, I think CNN or something, I mentioned I'm looking forward to complete retirement. Then you express, then what will happen? This kind of meeting, if you retired. Then I told him, don't worry. As far as political responsibility is concerned, I have decided now retire. Not only because of myself retire, but almost 4-century-old tradition. The Dalai Lama institution is both head of the secular and spirituality. And that I happily, voluntarily, proudly ended. But other sort of my commitment, this kind of a meeting is part of my sort of commitment regarding promotion of human value. So now it proved to you my retirement.
No doubt.
No effect by this kind of commitment. So then I must say, so many years, number of people, including Adam Samare, really work hard. So I, and you also, so many others, right, I think right from the beginning. So I want to tank. Then, of course, there's some participant, like Verala, no longer with us. But their wish and their spirit, we still continuously carry. So that's the way Buddha Shakyamuni came, 2,600 years past, but his spirit still carrying, like other great sort of masters. So those, I think, people who have real vision, they are physical no longer with us, but their spirit, their vision, our responsibility to carry continuously. So I very much appreciate. Then just ecology, ethics, and interdependence. Come on. Ethics, I doubt whether direct link with this kind of our sort of the research work. We are really also the scientific way to find out the reality. No concept of right or wrong or positive or negative. Then next, after finding the fact, then the next, yes, now the question of implication. What value? So like at the first, sort of just research how much effect with warm-heartedness. Simply, trying to find out the reality. What effect about anger, fear, suspicion, distrust? When we investigate these things, we have no idea anger is bad or compassion is good. No, simply try to find out the reality and its effect, its causes, like that. Then next, then the implication, right?
The ethical implications.
For our well-being. 그건 ethical 내지 그거 share 줘요 봐.
나래 지어래.
그래요.
주든 직샤.
So 대변님도 유저는 내들 chance.
나래. 간다 차상마 예배 계절에.
그래. Ecology. Yes, I think because science do the way. And interdependence, philosophical view, but very much sort of and that also is a way to explain the reality. Things exist due to another factor. So that's the basis of concept of interdependency. Here also is no idea of good or bad, just the reality. So that's just I felt like that.
Okay.
So now the next few days, because of our discussion will be because of the serious discussion, and then eventually we can share with more people who have some interest in this respect, in this field. And also our responsibility to create more interest in other people's mind.
Exactly.
So here now ethics, everybody agree, a lot of problem here on this planet. Every morning when I listen BBC, some problem, some killing here, there, here and there. And recently in England, some unrest has happened there. I'm really shocked. Here's among group, some Englishmen, no English.
Any British do kasi
Oh, you?
Ram British.
그래.
아잘라.
British way. So I really see shocked, surprised, because say I had this sort of impression, Britisher, the old colonialist or imperialist, become very mature. The several occasions when I visit, you see, England, the police hardly, you see,
Visible, not very visible. Presence of police.
People generally self-disciplined. That kind of my impression. So I said something happened, and I really surprised. In any way, so the problem. And just this morning, BBC, some interview, the flood victim in Pakistan. And consulta the 가서 러시아죠, 알아? 러시아죠.
네.
the muy dangomarsudo.
Yes.
The dunda kashan shared words.
His Holiness heard on the BBC news broadcast that the aid workers who are helping the victims of the floods, and they're running out of money, and they're going to run out within a week or so.
Very sad, isn't it? So then further you see investigate why such things happen. Of course, major disaster beyond our control, but some kind of preparation by the concerned people, and people, general public living standard a bit higher. And this, I think, certainly can be less suffering. So here now is my point is corruption. All these are problems. I think corruption really made because of the serious effect in Africa and many areas. So now corruption almost like has a new disease cancer disease of the whole planet, whole humanity. What is wrong? Not due to lack of sort of the judiciary system, or lack of sort of police force, or lack of sort of government sort of organization, but ultimately due to lack of ethics here, lack of self-discipline. Self-discipline entirely based on ethics. I had the opportunity to explore other, as a cheating other, but I'm a human being. I should not do that, isn't it? Even your own sort of the reputation.
For your own well-being.
So ultimately, we also have the responsibility to make awareness. The many problems which we are facing is ultimately the lack of inner discipline, moral ethics. So now, the way to promote moral ethics based on religion. The religions, including Buddhism, last 1,000 years existed there but failed. So now we must find ways, means, is to make conviction
in others.
Conviction others. The ethics, your own interest, your own health, sort of, because of that.
Well-being.
Health well-being, family well-being, like that, isn't it? So that is main sort of main aim. So we have some sort of addition, we have some sort of moral responsibility to make known more people like that. So I really appreciate all participants, particularly all the scientists. And because of Riki Samare.
No. Richie Long.
Richie, I think you made, I think, great sort of also the contribution. John contribution at all 16 has one of the page of our share.
Yes, look at this law.
Korangimi, Hudabadag, the single land, charity, the Gurdin's temple church.
The contribution that Richie you have made with such motivation is something that I feel that I ought to not only acknowledge but also repay your kindness.
But meantime, humble. That's very good. That I like. If good scientists were too much proud, I may not develop respect. Isn't it? Even religious leaders, some are very, very. I think the Rinpoche's ultimate Guruji, like Miller Rebbe, wonderful teacher, isn't it? But some of his followers, not quite because of the luxuries.
Luxurious lifestyle.
Okay, now okay, too much.
Thank you so much for those words, Your Holiness. It's a wonderful beginning for what I think will be a very rich meeting. As you know, this is a quite unusual forum. Here we have an integrative, collaborative dialogue between science, spiritual traditions, and the humanities, philosophy, and so on. Quite unusual. And we're going to use these multiple perspectives to address the current environmental crisis. This is a very unusual topic, as you know, for Mind and Life. Out of 23 meetings, I think only 2, this is the second one, have addressed the life side of Mind and Life. But we felt that because, as you'll hear from the scientists today, there's both sad and bad news today, and also and this week, and some very hopeful news. But at the beginning, we're going to make the scientific case that as a species, we're engaged in what amounts to a slow motion suicide if we continue the way we are now. And it's because of the urgency and the moral importance of that that we felt this was a compelling topic for Mind and Life meeting. You, in your talks, often cite the love of a mother for her child as the basis for compassion. But we're facing a real paradox, and that is that even though we love our children as much as anyone has in human history, each of us unwittingly acts in ways daily that are creating a future for this planet and for our own children and their children, which will be much, much worse. The problem is this. You're going to hear a phrase that's very important. It's the Anthropocene age. Anthropocene, what is Anthropocene? Human cause. Yeah, Diana will go into it in more detail, but basically it's geological history goes over millions of years. But in the last few hundred, we've entered a unique time in history. It's the first time the actions of one species are altering the planetary systems that support life itself in a negative way. That's the slow motion suicide. And basically we confront the dilemma that we have an urgent, compelling need to save us from our worst enemy, which is ourselves. And I feel that Buddhism and Christian theology and philosophy and psychology all have very important perspectives to offer science. Science documents what's happening, but doesn't have within it necessarily the mechanism to mobilize people to act in a skillful way. So that's the particular aspect of reality or truth we're seeking to explore over the course of the week. The problem from a point of view of evolutionary psychology is this. Our brains were formed over several 100,000 years, and the alarm system in the brain, the system that recognizes threat and danger, was designed for snarling tigers, not for the very subtle causes of this planetary degradation. Our sensory system actually does not register the danger. It's too big, it's too small, it's invisible to us. And our amygdala and those circuitry that you've heard about in many, many meetings, the alarm system of the brain doesn't go off because it doesn't realize there's a danger. This makes it very hard to motivate people to do anything about what actually is perhaps the worst crisis in human history. And yet people go through their daily lives as though it were not happening. We're all, in a sense, in a trance. There's no sense of immediate threat because of this design flaw in the brain. So let me give you a quick overview before we begin with our speaker. This week is divided into 3 parts. The first 3 sessions will be the science. Let's get that on the table so we know what the facts are. Then we turn to ethical considerations. And once we see the need to act very clearly, then finally we get to action and what follows from our explorations. In a little more detail, just quickly, our first speaker will be Diana Liverman, who will be speaking on the human impact on the global systems that sustain life, how human activities are threatening the safe zone for life on this planet. Then Jonathan Patz will talk about the links between the destruction of these systems and our health. And this raises many ethical questions too. For example, the fact that it's the activities of the wealthiest people in the world that are creating a crisis that will impact mostly the poorest people in the world. This and many other ethical issues. And then Gregory Norris is going to share with us, with a newly possible precision, the impacts of everything we buy and do. How this glass or this computer has degraded those global systems. In other words, so he has a methodology for making visible the invisible, so which brings this global crisis down to the individual level. Once we know that, then we can start to make decisions that matter. Then the second part of the meeting will be moderated by John Dunn, and our first speaker will be Claire Palmer, who's sitting next to Matthew, who is a philosopher, and her specialty is environmental ethics, a new field within philosophy. And she'll give us an overview of the issues as that field looks at it, how they conceptualize what the ethical dilemmas are. And then our next speaker will be someone you may have seen before, Matthew Ricard. I think Matthew may have been in every meeting, at least every meeting I've attended. And Matthew will give a short presentation on how we treat other species as a case in point. And then Sally McVeigh, who's the Christian theologian, will share a view from a Christian perspective on the role of religion in facing the planetary environmental crisis and how our worldview shapes our actions and motivations and decisions, and how important it is to understand that view and change it in a way that leads to constructive action. And then Wednesday afternoon, we're actually looking forward to you presenting a Buddhist perspective on ethics. Then the third part of the meeting, which will be moderated by Roshi Joan Halifax, will be on ethics in action. It's not enough to understand what's wrong. We need to do something about it. So our first presentation will be by Ilka Weber, who's a psychologist from Columbia. She'll review hundreds and hundreds of studies and what they tell us about the psychology of action and behavior change. What motivates people to act and what keeps people from acting. And then we can think how to use that information effectively. And then Thupten Jinpa will give a Buddhist perspective on the psychology of action, really the Buddhist view of the same question. What leads to action, what gets in the way, and how can we help people be more disposed to take action. And then finally, Dekila Jungyalpa, who's with the World Wildlife Foundation, will talk about skillful means and activism, what successful environmental action looks like, and she'll present a case of working with the problem of putting dams on the Mekong River, which has a lot of implications for the river, all the rivers that flow out of the Tibetan Plateau. And Friday afternoon will be an open time to reflect together on all of this, on what it means, what the implications are. So let me introduce our first speaker. Diana Liverman is an environmental scientist at Oxford University and at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Institute on the Environment and is also a professor of geography and development. In other words, she looks at how environmental changes and so on are affecting the developing world, and heads an institute there that specializes in this. And she's written many, many books and scholarly articles on the subject. I was thrilled that she agreed to come because she's the co-author of a paper that really changed my view of the whole crisis, and she's going to share with us the insights from this scholarly work, which examines. We often hear about global warming. It's talked about much, but actually global warming is only one dimension of 8 or 9 world systems that support life itself. And so she's going to give us the whole perspective of how human activity affects those systems. So I'm just going to shift chairs with Diana.
Nishan kishin mo shungwe. The exam maybe do.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Your Holiness, it's a great honor.
Cousin should be lower end. The Nishan the Sharma. Cousin lower. The Kwan Yung Men Dare. Kwan Joman. Danishan as the end. Dancer the Mebe. Professor Sharma. So Sharma New York. Cause lawyer. Shamalere. Oh, hello. My long-time friend, Professor. Thank you. Good morning. Okay, that's. Nishan page everything. License officer. Oh, okay. That okay. Yes.
Yes. Your Holiness, it's a great honor to talk to you, and I bring very best wishes from many of my friends and colleagues. I'm going to be talking to you today about the many ways that humans are changing the global environment and transforming the planet in ways that affect our potential for survival and the survival of many other species. I represent an international group of scientists that's working very hard to try and understand what's happening to the Earth system, and how humans are changing it for better or worse. And I've begun my presentation with this beautiful photograph of the Barashigri Glacier, which is not far from Dharamsala. And it illustrates one of our concerns, that the burning of fossil fuels and the cutting of our forests is putting gases into the atmosphere that are warming the planet. And this is warming the planet to the point where ice and snow is disappearing. And this particular glacier is retreating by 30 meters every year, so it's becoming smaller and smaller. This is the outline of my talk. And what I want to do is to set the scene for the conversations this week by showing how the rate of human impact on the planet has been accelerating in the last 60 years, a new era that we're calling the Anthropocene, and I'll explain more about that. And I'm going to make the point that these changes are not just affecting the climate, a problem I know that you're very concerned about, but they also include multiple risks to life, threats to our water resources, to ecosystems, pollution, and the overuse of resources. I'm then going to discuss the idea of planetary boundaries, which is the idea of setting limits that could guide the way in which we use the planet. And I'm going to talk about a set of environmental thresholds that we want to avoid, not just dangerous climate change, but also the loss of species through biodiversity, the acidification of the ocean, and the way in which we're using too much water, too much land, too many resources in ways that are changing the planet. Slow down, yes, I apologize. And then I'll end with an update on the latest results about climate change, and particularly some results about the Himalayan region. Because since the last 5 years, when the last big study was done on climate change by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, we have a lot of latest scientific results that give us even greater concern. So this first slide here shows 100,000 years of human history. And what it shows is the way in which the Earth's average temperature has changed over the last 100,000 years. And what you can see here is that 100,000 years ago, the Earth was much cooler than it is today. The temperature, at least until about 1950, was about 13.5 degrees centigrade. The average temperature of the Earth was about 13.5. But if you go back into the deep past, the Earth...
under you the 100,000 능술제 100,000 공 under the temperature shares one that the ande 즉 폼으로 지금 알아 봐. 뒤차 사니까 시거래. 뒷마샤고는 다 당고 변은 자가 자조가 되어서 여러다. 지난데 그네 시거든.
So this time frame that you're using and the reference to the average temperature, so what is the kind of framework in which you are making
obviously,
that
as far as I know, you see some part of the world today, like Siberia, very cold, but there are indication one time very hot sort of because of that plateau. Some use animal who live very hot climate is found there. So then India, like I think many years ago, under sea, go like that. So this 100,000 years, under you
So the changes that His Holiness is referring to, it's not within this time frame.
No.
Remendo.
The changes about which you are talking are over millions of years. So 2 million years ago. This is really relatively recent in geologic time.
That's right. So that and there's weather pattern sure.
So this is really a time frame which includes the weather pattern that we see today. So it's kind of the basic pattern of the weather systems.
The geographical is cold countries or hot countries that today's pattern already started.
This period actually includes 2 geologic periods. It includes the period of the ice ages.
Ice age, yes.
Yes, and this is the period in which modern humans lived on Earth. And what the graph shows, at the left is the oldest period, is that there were 90,000 years when it was quite cold. And this was the period of the ice ages. And there were very few humans who were migrating around the Earth. They were living from hunting, from gathering plants, and from fishing. And the point I want to show is if you get to the right-hand side of the graph, there's a 10,000-year period where it warmed up to a much more comfortable climate of just less than 15 degrees centigrade. And what's interesting is that this is the period when agriculture developed. It's when the great civilizations developed. And many people think of it as this sort of ideal period for human development and for many other species. So this period, the period of the ice ages...
What do you mean? Because of many other species. Because me civilization, because civilization, yes.
Plants, animals that we know today. And
Yeah.
I'll point more, yeah. So this period here, this
Yes.
10,000 years,
10,000 years.
was the period which was very good for humanity. It's the period when our populations grew, when we were able to grow food, when the great civilizations developed. And this period is what we call the Holocene. The previous year of the previous period of the Ice Ages is the Pleistocene. And the reason I wanted to show you this, Your Holiness, is that this Holocene period was a period of relative balance for humans and the planet. And it's a period when we lived in relative harmony. And I'm showing you this to set the stage for what we are now doing, which is taking ourselves out of the Holocene into a period that could be much more challenging for humans and for other species, plants and animals on the planet. So to summarize this slide, for the last 10,000 years, the Earth system has been in balance. Human activities have had moderate but not global impacts on the planet. But about 250 years ago, things changed, particularly with the Industrial Revolution and with advances in medicine that allowed populations to grow. And what I'll do now is talk not about the last 10,000 years of this sort of rather ideal period for humanity, but about the last 250 years. And what I want to show you is a series of graphs that show the human activities and how they've grown over the last 200 to 250 years. And each graph shows growing human activity on the planet. And you'll see on each of these graphs that I've put a dotted line at 1950. And I will be talking about that because on almost every graph you can see a growth until about 1950, and then it starts to accelerate. We've had a great acceleration in our human impact. And we noticed this. This is the work of my friend Will Steffen, and he put together a series of graphs. And when we sat down and looked at them, we suddenly realized that there was a real change in the rate of growth at around 1950. So let me show you the series of graphs that show these increases in human activity and resource use.
So
so it's probably, primarily due to industrial
It's
revolution.
primarily, it's the growth in human population, but also the growth in resource use. Each person, particularly in the industrialized world, using more resources. So it's very important not just to blame people having children, but it's how much each of those people consume. So the first is the graph of population, and you can see the rapid growth in population. But actually, this is one graph where we do have some good news, because we know now that population is likely to level off at around 2050 at about 9 billion people. So it's one of the only drivers where we see perhaps some good news. The second...
good news. Family plan. Yes.
Or is it simply naturally occurring?
It's the result of a choice of millions of women around the world to have less children. And
Yes, through awareness, through education.
yeah. And it's often because women have more opportunities, there's more health care for them, they have been educated, and when this happens, they make the choice that they would like to have less children. So. This is the second graph, which is of water use. And you can see again, when the graph doesn't go back to 17...
So this reduction so he's always wondering this reduction in the fertility rate that we're seeing, and you spoke about 2050 as being kind of leveling off period. So it has nothing to do with some kind of changes happening in the genetic dispositions of the humans for reduction in fertility rate.
Not that I know of.
You see, due to climate or some other sort of reason.
I think it's due to choices and the availability of technologies for controlling fertility.
Yes, good.
Yes, yeah. So this next graph shows the growth in water use, and when the left-hand side of the graph is blank, it's because we don't have the data. So we didn't have any good data on water use until around 1900. But you can see here again the rapid growth in water use around the world. And again, it looks as though things have gone faster since 1950. This is the damming of the world's rivers. And again, you can see this rapid increase since 1900, and particularly since 1950, where we've made this decision, for better or worse, to control the rivers of the planet.
별 둘로 중시하다.
So 1950 also coincides with the political upheaval in Tibet.
So since then everything goes wrong.
Oh dear. I should have another graph. It's also when I was born.
The bad year.
So this next graph is the use of chemical fertilizers,
yes.
not traditional fertilizers. And here again, you can see a great growth. And here, the change in 1950 is associated with the Green Revolution, which was the large increase in agricultural production, particularly in India. And as I expect you know, the increase in food production, whilst less people were hungry, it meant the use of a lot more agricultural chemicals.
Yes.
And we can see this change as after 1950. There is an interesting decline here, which has to do with the economic problems in the developing world when people can't afford fertilizer now. Then this slide is one more indicator of our human activity. This is the consumption of paper, which is, of course, linked to the destruction of the world's forests for paper. And here again, you can see this very rapid increase. Perhaps that will decline a little bit with the use of computers now, when we don't print out so much paper.
Yes.
One good thing about computers. And then this one is very dramatic. This is the growth in the use of the motor vehicle. And of course, motor vehicles produce all sorts of pollution, both in the cities like Delhi and in the atmosphere, because the oil that they use is producing greenhouse gases that are warming the planet, like a blanket warms one in bed. So we have this very dramatic increase in motor vehicles. So to sum this up, the point I want to make here is that human activities have been growing and growing in their magnitude, in their size, and particularly since 1950. And we have coined the term the Great Acceleration, which is what happened when everything took off in 1950. And the Great Acceleration is a period not only of acceleration in human activity, but also acceleration in environmental consequences on the Earth system, which is what I will now show you. But before I do that, I just wanted to clarify for you, Your Holiness, and for other people in the audience, what we mean by an Earth system. The Earth system really relates to interconnection, one of the themes this week. It's the Earth's interacting physical, chemical, and biological processes. The Earth system consists of the land, oceans, atmosphere, and living things, all interconnected. It also includes the planet's natural cycles. These are chemicals that cycle through the Earth, through rocks, through life, through the atmosphere. And the most important are the carbon cycle, the water cycle of water, the cycle of nitrogen, which is both natural and in fertilizers, and cycles which I will not talk about of phosphorus, sulfur, and others. life is an integral part of every one of these chemical cycles. We affect the carbon cycle because we breathe carbon dioxide. We plant crops that take up carbon dioxide. We affect nitrogen in the way we practice agriculture. We affect the water cycle in many ways through consuming water, through building dams that change the flow of water. So it's very important to remember that the Earth system is not separate from us. We're part of it. We're part of the Earth system. It includes human society. But our impact is such that we are disturbing the balance of these natural cycles. And for scientists, the complexity of all these cycles is both beautiful, but it also makes it very difficult for us to understand what's happening, because everything is interconnected. A change in one place will affect very far away. But let's take a look now at what the great acceleration in human activity has done to the environment and to the planet. This is a graph with which you may be familiar, Your Holiness, which is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These are the greenhouse gases that are warming the planet. Like a greenhouse can warm the plants within it, or a blanket can warm a person in bed. And what we see here is that the use of fossil fuel, of coal and oil, the driving of vehicles, the cutting of forests, has led to this rapid increase in carbon dioxide. And again, you can see the great acceleration after 1950. A related change...
벽에 나가서 그래.
나.
카본 주스니.
어.
벽에 나가서 그래.
벽에 나가려.
야말 본다.
단어 개탄이 사바 소유는 감마도 주면.
수도
가.
That's my base.
솔레제. 솔레제. 솔제스. 솔제스.
Yeah. A
Holiness is wondering whether we have coined a Tibetan equivalent for the term carbon.
Oh, okay. Yes. This is a second greenhouse gas because it's not just carbon dioxide that is warming the planet. There are other gases, and this is the gas called methane. And methane is associated particularly with the growth in the world's livestock numbers, with cows and sheep. And there's been a great growth in the population of animals, particularly because of people eating meat. And
chicken 유기로.
And chicken, but chicken less.
러시아. 단데 러시아 군주들이
네.
Less methane.
Beef farms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, the animals emit different amounts of methane. Cattle are probably the most serious in terms of the amount of methane because they have 4 stomachs which produce a lot of...
거기다 쪼들에 뚜르다제 되게 가스디 나로 메탄 죽심부터 와. 근데 뚜르 친구들이 도고카 시즈요 되고 니마치
도고카 시였어요.
그 투브르 시체가 그래도 군주.
Yeah.
지금 다들
그 둘이 시골어요.
나 쪼다.
안래. Yes.
Okay. The methane also comes from rubbish dumps, places that... Yes.
Diana, is it true that I heard that a single cow can release enough methane gas to lift up a hot air balloon? Is that true? I mean,
I
is it
don't
just
know if it's true. I can research it.
그무당 두고서. 버주 두단.
뚜루망 다 사샤베나 버주 지금 강부야 로탄지.
But it is true that in some parts of the world where cattle are kept in one large building, that they capture the methane and they use it to heat the building or the farmhouse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they can recycle it.
Ariel.
The other source of methane is waste dumps, where we put large amounts of our rubbish. And as that rubbish decomposes, it releases the methane gas. So there are many ways, both our choice of raising livestock and eating meat, but also that we throw so many things away that is causing the rise in the methane concentration. And that too is warming the planet, just like carbon dioxide. And what this results in is...
everybody knows global warming.
Yes.
That the percentage, of course, naturally, you see, the whole sort of system I think that
Go through
million
change now.
million years ago.
Nare, million years now.
Million years, gradually it's changing.
Let's go through a
Gradually,
cycle.
always
Yeah.
changing, always
Yes.
changing. So that also, I think, a part of the factor, global warming.
Nare.
So the percentage, global warming, me and the social percentage,
So His Holiness is wondering whether the scientists can actually calculate the percentage of the rate at which global warming is taking place that is actually the results of human impact. Because there is a natural cycle through which the Earth glows, the Earth climate goes through.
Yes. Yes, we can. And one of the most important things is that we're changing the greenhouse gas composition of the atmosphere much faster than the natural cycles. So the natural cycles are over many thousands of years, and we've changed
Yes.
it in a period of just 100 years. And we also, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now the highest it has been for 650,000 years as a result of human activity. So it's the highest it's been in a very, very long period. And we can know that it is our greenhouse gases through looking at the chemistry. And the result of all of these gases is another graph that you may have seen before, Your Holiness, which is the observed warming of the planet. This is the average temperature of the planet since 1880 in degrees centigrade. And what we're showing is a variation around the average. So the thing to look at is the growth in the temperature. And in particular, that the last 10 years since 2000, we've had 10 of the warmest years on record. Last year tied with 2005 as the hottest in the recorded recent human history. So, and as we will hear, this global warming has tremendous impacts on the world system, on our ice, on our water, on our lives, and on our health. It'll come back, we hope. Yes, good.
What
So
is that?
what are those markers supposed to?
They're showing the average variability in the, from year to year, because the temperature goes up and down.
Yes.
There are other cycles that affect global temperature. For example, when there's a volcanic eruption, it gets a little cooler. When we have changes in ocean currents that happen naturally, we can have a cooler year. So right now, we have sea surface temperatures in parts of the Pacific that are cooling some areas of the planet, called La Niña is the term that it's called. So there are variations from year to year, but the long-term trend is, I think, what we should focus on, which is that it's getting so much warmer.
Yunguyoruz now.
Yeah. And I just want to show you a few more impacts that are not related to climate change. This is another impact which is associated with our use of chemicals for refrigeration and for air conditioning. And this is the depletion of the protective ozone layer, which is what protects us from skin cancer. And you can see here since 1950 that there has been a loss of the ozone layer, and this has increased the risks of cancer. So it's one other impact. Here's another very dramatic impact of human activity. This is the loss of tropical rainforests and woodlands around the world. And here again, you can see the great acceleration of human activity creating this great acceleration in the impact on the planet. And this is the exploitation of fisheries as we take more fish, not just for ourselves, but also you may be aware that in many countries we feed fish to our pets in great amounts. And so this is a big increase in the exploitation of fisheries in the ocean. Okay. And this is one more, which is the pollution of coastal waters by our use of nitrogen fertilizer. And when these waters get polluted, it creates dead zones of no oxygen. This is the loss of biodiversity.
그게 뭐지?
Oh, we have lost the...
Yeah.
어?
No, I think, you can go. Yeah, it's
Oh.
back.
Is that okay?
It's back,
I
yeah.
apologize to the audience. So this
그게 안
is...
치면서.
This one,
There's
Okay.
okay.
but people can see.
No.
Okay. And this is the loss of species, the loss of biodiversity through the way we have made species extinct. So again, to summarize, I think I tell a very
이
dramatic
스피시스를
story.
전에 수학자 장자래 야 플란트 이렇게 쉬워.
Includes plants as well. This is when you
Yes,
speak about
plants, insects,
Yes.
fish, all of
Yeah.
the fellow species on the planet. So to sum up this part of the talk, we've shifted from the Holocene now to the Anthropocene, which is a planet that is completely shaped by humans. We have entered this new geologic era, which Nobel Prize winner Paul Crutzen called the Anthropocene, where human activity now shapes the planet more than any other factor. And the term Anthropocene comes from anthro, which means human, and scene, which means era. So it's the human era we believe we have entered.
에라
And
논줄
말해. 두고. No.
This is a very powerful photo. I don't know if you've ever seen it before, Your Holiness. This was created from satellite images, and it shows the human impact on the planet through our use of energy for light. So it's actually a photograph of the Anthropocene, if you like. You can see how the industrial world is brighter because it uses so much energy. Because most of the electricity that produces these lights is produced from coal, oil, and gas, these lights also represent emissions of greenhouse gases and of air pollution. The photo shows that some regions are much more responsible than others for this light and for this pollution. One of the interesting things is you can see that much of Africa, Latin America, and the Tibetan Plateau is dark. These are areas that are not contributing to greenhouse gases and to air pollution. It's because either people are not there, or people are poor, or people are living in harmony with the planet.
그러면 좀 못해버려 맞다. 시에시도 그렇게 맞아 말봐.
His Holiness is saying that it's because they are not capable. It's not because they know that it's wrong and, acting out of discipline.
Not out of awareness or self-discipline. I think everywhere. I think all these.
Yeah. I think the planet is grateful, whichever is the excuse. What we have here is that you can also see that North America, Europe, India, Japan, and the coast of China are much lighter. Clearly, some people and regions are placing a much greater burden on the planet than others. But overall, this photograph is a good example of what we mean by the human-dominated planet of the Anthropocene. And clearly, the fact that we now dominate the planet brings great responsibility. So I'm running out of time, so please excuse me if I speak a little fast. Your Holiness, there's a further reason for concern. We think that the growing impact of human activity on life support systems may take us to dangerous thresholds. This is a photo of a child looking over a waterfall. And what we're worried about is that by warming the planet, by destroying species, we may actually take ourselves to thresholds where change will be very sudden and rapid, or even irreversible. So to give you an example, we're worried that global warming may trigger some abrupt and rapid changes, such as the breakup of the great ice sheets in Antarctica, or the large-scale release of greenhouse gases from frozen ground, where they've been trapped, but as the ground warms, they could be released, and that would add to the warming of the planet. And we're also concerned that some of the world's great forests, which currently absorb carbon dioxide, may become drier and not be able to do that role within the cycle. So some of these changes could be very difficult to reverse. So we want to avoid getting to those thresholds. Another example would be the ocean threshold, where the world's oceans, we've got combined effects. Carbon dioxide is actually making the ocean more acid, and that's affecting species in the ocean, particularly coral reefs. We're also overfishing the ocean, and we are also putting fertilizer into the ocean. All of this can combine to destroy parts of the ocean.
So how does the fertilizer get into the ocean?
Sorry?
How does the fertilizer get into the ocean?
Through the great rivers of the
Oh,
world.
I see.
Yes. So, for example, the Mississippi River in the US carries all of the agricultural pollution into the Gulf of Mexico and poisons life in that region. So these sudden, rapid, and possibly irreversible thresholds need to be understood, monitored, and avoided. And we sometimes call them tipping points, as if I leant forward on the chair and then fell off, which I won't do, but yeah, so we're very worried about these tipping points. And so a group of us came together to try to set some guidelines for avoiding falling over these thresholds. And we set what we call a set of planetary boundaries to guide the management of the planet. And of course, you don't want to set the guide right at the top of the cliff. You want time to change. You want time to put on the brakes. You want to take account of the fact that we may not be exactly sure where the boundary is. So this is an example where a car is driving towards the cliff, and we want to put the brakes on in plenty of time. So we've set the thresholds at a safe distance from where we think the actual boundary of collapse may be. And this is a diagram of the planetary boundaries that we have established. And I don't have time to talk about all of them, Your Holiness. Oh, okay, he's telling me I do have time to talk about them. Okay. So we identified a set of boundaries to create a safe operating space for the planet. And this project was led by my friend Johan Rockström, who lives in Stockholm. And the idea here is to set the limits to keep us away from the danger zones. We've identified a set of thresholds that define a safe space for humanity. And I'll just tell you briefly what each of them are. The first boundary is to avoid the risks of dangerous climate change. And we've set that at a technical limit of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I won't go into detail of each of the scientific amounts. The general idea is that we have this set of boundaries. So the second is to prevent the depletion of the ozone layer, to avoid the risk of cancer. The third is one that we haven't been able to define yet, but it has to do with aerosols, dust and soot in the atmosphere that can be dangerous to human health and to ecology.
So it's a product of human action.
Yes, from our fires, from our automobiles. It's what makes our laundry, our white laundry, dirty, but it also makes our lungs dirty. The fourth boundary is designed to save the oceans from becoming acid, from becoming like vinegar. And that is the boundary that we need to save the oceans. The fifth boundary, which is here, is to prevent us using too much water. It sets a limit on what the planet as a whole can take in terms of the human use of water. The sixth is difficult to define here, but it's to do with all of the toxic chemicals that we're putting into the environment. Plastics, heavy metals that are poisonous like lead. And we need to limit that, but we haven't yet been able to calculate the exact boundary. The eighth is to limit the loss of biodiversity, to try to prevent us from making other species going extinct. And then the final boundary limits the pollution from nitrogen and phosphorus, such as the pollution from chemical fertilizers. Now, this diagram is a little complicated, but what I want to show you is the history of our march, our walk towards these thresholds and these danger zones. And I'm just going to show you the difference between 1950 and the present day. So each of these lines is sort of the walk towards the cliff. And here is the safe boundary here. The collapse would be somewhere out beyond the safe zone. And what I've tried to show here is that in the 1950s, we were already walking, marching, taking the planet towards the danger zone of the conversion of forests to agricultural land use. We were starting to put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and approaching that boundary. And here's our use of nitrogen fertilizer, also taking us towards the boundary. Some of the variables we had not measured in 1950, so we couldn't document where we were. We have estimated this for the 1970s and the 1990s, but I will take you straight to the present day. And it's very dramatic. What has happened, no, that's in 50 years. Yes, in 50 years, we have gone out of the safe zone on 3 variables. So each of the colors is a 10-year period. So in 1960s, we were here, 1970s, 1990s, and then this is the present day. And so what we find is that we have gone over the safe boundary for climate change, for nitrogen pollution, and for the loss of biodiversity. But there is some good news. This looks terrible, where we have gone beyond the boundaries, but there are some where we're still well within the safe zone. So, for example, in terms of our freshwater consumption, we still have room for more water to be used. But the problem is if you look at it on the planet, there are some parts where we've gone over the boundary of water use and some where we haven't used it yet. And you can see that there's one piece of good news here, which is with ozone depletion, which was in 1990, we were closer to the danger zone than we are now. And that's because the world got together and agreed to control the chemicals that were damaging the ozone layer. And so now the ozone layer is... Yeah, the ozone layer is beginning to heal. So this shows that we can, in fact, bring ourselves away from the boundaries. We're now going to go to my final piece of my talk, which is just to bring us back to the Himalayas.
So the example of the ozone layer seems to suggest that not only examples such as that, it seems to suggest that not only do we have a possibility of moving away from the danger zone, but also actually reducing, not only kind of preventing us from going to the danger zone, but in fact trying to go back.
Yes, and that is our hope. Yeah.
Oh, that's good news now.
But it's very important that we move back from those boundaries before we hit the threshold. Because once we go over a threshold, it could be very difficult to come back over the cliff. So I want to end with a brief update on some of the latest research results on climate change. And I've just put a picture of the Himalayas. I'm not going to show more graphs. I know Your Holiness is already very aware and concerned about global warming and its impact on the landscapes and lives of people in this region. We're working very hard to monitor and explain what's happening and what may happen in the future to the climate in different regions. Many colleagues of mine agreed to share their latest work, knowing that I would be talking to you. And even last night, people were sending me latest science results. I won't be able to share them all with you. The first thing I wanted to mention is that despite the fact that the countries of the world have met regularly to try to control greenhouse gas emissions, and some efforts have been made, the gases are continuing to increase. So these greenhouse gases are continuing to grow. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now almost 40% above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And as I mentioned, it's the highest in 650,000 years. China has just become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases at 2 billion gigatons, which is a big share. It's followed by the US and then by India. So this group here is very close to responsibility in a sense, or geographically to these regions. Of course, the emissions per person...
Europe together, Europe to Japan?
But what about Europe and Japan? Because it was very bright in that photograph.
Yes. If I treated Europe as one country, it would be higher than India. But being English, I treat Europe as separate countries.
When we talk about global business, this is unethical.
So if you want to treat Europe as a whole, Europe would still be less than China or the US, but I think Europe would be greater than India. And Japan has actually declined slightly. It has a very efficient economy that is helping. Now, one very interesting thing, of course, is that the per capita emissions are very different. So in the US, we consume 5 tons of carbon per year. In China, it's 0.6, and in India, 0.2. So each person in India is much less responsible than a person in the US. There's one other interesting result I wanted to share with you, is that of China's emissions, 1/3, we think, of China's emissions are consumed in the US through the export of goods from China to the US. So in a sense, American consumers are responsible for 1/3 of China's emissions. And the same is true as a result of other trading patterns. If these trends continue in terms of overall increase in greenhouse gases, the latest computer modeling results suggest that the world could warm by 5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, 2100. So that's 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And that we could have a world that would be 4 degrees centigrade warmer within 50 or 60 years from now. And this is a significant change over, for example, the big UN report in 2007. The latest results are pushing up the estimate of what the temperature would be, both because of the emissions, but also because of improvements in the science and the better models. Unfortunately, better models give us worse results in terms of what we think may happen to the climate. Okay. Yes? So we're worried that it's going to be warmer than we even thought it was going to be. And one example of that is there's a recent paper published that suggests that the heat waves that we get today, so like in Delhi when it's 45 degrees C, that in the future those will become the average and the extremes could be 50. So the summer average will be what the most extreme conditions are today. And this is of great concern because heat waves especially affect the poor.
Yes.
Okay, just a couple more points. In terms of the glaciers in the Himalayas, I wanted to just confirm the scientific results that suggest that many of the glaciers are losing their volume. especially those that are at lower altitudes. This is linked to warming, because the Tibetan Plateau, for example, has warmed almost more than anywhere else on Earth, 1.8 degrees centigrade warming in recent years. But there's a new factor that's contributing to the melting of the glaciers, and that's the deposition of air pollution, dust and soot on the glaciers, which makes them melt more rapidly. So it's not just warming, it's also air pollution that is contributing to the loss of the glaciers. However, I did want to tell you that some of the popular stories that all of the ice will disappear are very unlikely. Many of the glaciers are so high in the Himalayas that even warming will not cause them to melt. But we do think that we could lose 40% of the volume of the glaciers by even perhaps by the middle of the century. And this, of course, is creating problems with lakes that are filling up and risking floods in places like Bhutan. And it's also eventually going to cause problems with the flow of rivers. But I did want to let you know that we don't need to worry about all of the rivers in the same way, because many of the rivers in Asia get most of their water from the monsoon, not from the glaciers. So the two rivers that we're most concerned about, because of the importance of glacier melt, are the Brahmaputra and the Indus. So the final thing I wanted to share with you is that although many people in this region of Asia are worried about the melting glaciers, we need to really be much more worried about what climate change will do to the monsoon. And this is where I feel a little unable as a scientist to tell you what's going to happen to the monsoon. There are some very contradictory results recently about what will happen. What we think is that climate change will mean that wetter areas will get more rain and drier areas will get less. So the monsoon might become more intense, but perhaps might be delayed in its start. But this is a scientific frontier, and it's one of the areas where we're doing a lot of research, because we now understand how important the future of the monsoon will be to this part of the world. So with that, I'll finish, and I hope it provides a good context for our discussion, and I look forward to any questions you might have. But thank you for the opportunity very much.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
We're running a little late for our tea break, which was supposed to be 15 minutes ago. So we'll have it now, but we'll be hyper punctual, so we can have the most time left for discussion of this, I think, quite powerful presentation. Thank you. So now is the tea break time, and we'll convene back here in 12 minutes or so. For everyone, a very powerful set of scientific data that raises many questions. And so I'd like to offer you the chance to ask the first question, if you have, or to make a response.
No, nothing. As I mentioned, the leaders should know more. This is serious matter. Sometimes ecology, fashion, green party, like that. But these are not that because of the fashion.
Sometimes the problem with environmental movement is that it can become a kind of a fad.
Yes.
But when we look at the data, it's a very serious matter. So His Holiness was expressing the wish that these kind of data should really be exposed to the global leaders.
So people who have the responsibility, once they fully should convince, and also people, of course, those free country leader become through election. So more awareness. That I just I felt, and then something like I mentioned, like UN, some world body, it should have some more clear sort of awareness with these things. Then they look these things are more seriously.
Well, this raises a lot of issues. Diana, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I just wanted to say, Your Holiness, that as you're aware, the next big UN meeting on the environment is in Rio next June. And scientists are doing what they can to provide scientific input to the meeting. But I have really noticed that there seems to be less attention to this meeting than to previous meetings. It almost seems as though the world's attention has turned away from the environment at the moment. And therefore, it's a little frustrating because it seems as though people aren't so prepared to listen at the moment.
Well, there's another dimension too, and that is that many of these reports are commissioned by governments or by the UN for leaders. But leaders exist in a political atmosphere where there are also vested economic interests, oil companies, gas companies. And so the findings have become politicized. And Diana, I think you have some experience with questions being raised about the credibility of the climate science. And people, for political reasons, trying to create doubt in people's minds about this data. So what's happening now in terms of climate? I know that was a very big issue. In fact, the data about Tibet was particularly called into question.
Yes, well, about 3 years ago, there was a orchestrated attack on the climate science, trying to undermine the credibility of much of the science that I presented to you. And it's been very difficult for climate science over the last 3 years because the media overplayed some of the criticisms. And even though there have now been many reports to respond to the criticisms showing that the science was correct, there might have been a couple of errors in 3,000 pages of documents. But we are human, we make a few errors. But we've been trying very hard to regain credibility of climate science over the last few years. And it's particularly difficult in the United States, where there is really a very strong criticism of climate change and unwillingness to accept climate change. And it's part of the political debate where the issues become very politicized. And we actually are having quite a hard time figuring out how to respond. How do we regain the trust of politicians and of the public in this science? But perhaps it's because the science is telling people things they don't want to hear about how they need to change. I'm not sure what the origins of this attack on the science is. But I would say that we're more and more confident about what we know, not less confident. So we're completely confident the Earth is warming. We know that the ice is disappearing. We know that it's human activity, almost, very confident that it's human activity. So we're just as confident as we were, but it seems as though some leaders have lost confidence in what we're saying.
Also, there's the assumption that awareness alone will be enough to cause leaders to act, or to cause anybody to act. But as we're going to hear in more detail over the course of the week, there's good evidence, and in fact, the fact that the acceleration is continuing is evidence in itself, that this may not be the case for most people. And I wonder if any of our panelists might speak to the gap between awareness and action. Elke?
Good morning, His Holiness. I just want to reiterate what Diana said, that it's actually very true that the climate change or other environmental disaster message is very uncomfortable for many people. We don't want to hear what the message is because the implications are so severe. We all have to change our way of life. We don't like change. I'm going to say much more about that on Thursday morning. And as a result of
But I think everybody if physicians say, oh, according to your the physical condition, you should not smoke too much, and then they will listen. I think once awareness and convincing develop, people will do. This is their own interest. Humanity is our own interest.
Of course. Rationally.
I think awareness. Still, we need to some more more effort.
More effort.
Awareness.
Bring awareness.
And like news, media people.
Media.
I think that's my feeling.
But people are not so easily convinced by this environmental data. You know, they're convinced by the physician, and when they're hurting. You know, when you're hurting, you realize you're sick. You need to do something. But when you look out of the window and people say there's climate change and it's snowing, people in Washington say there's no climate change.
This weather changing, and also this because of the melting.
Extreme melting of the glaciers.
This is a fact we can see.
Yes.
His Holiness.
Unless something you see the empty here, otherwise you see the more explanation. They will know. They should know.
His Holiness, think about tobacco and smoking. It took us 50 years to realize that we actually should ban tobacco, because even though the scientific data existed a long time ago. Statistics are not very convincing. You know, people like to believe their own senses. And by the time when our senses are telling us that there's a problem, it's going to be too late. And that's the real problem.
So in any case, our effort really has to find a way of reaching out to those who are not listening. Otherwise, we have no other alternative. So, and then make them listen and also make them convinced.
So I think
so now, modern time, scientists, sometimes I describe Guruji. The scientist Guru,
So in modern times, Solon was saying that he often refers to the scientist as occupying the position of the gurus of authority, you know. So the gurus need to come out and speak.
But I think that scientists at the moment who work on climate change, we're doing a lot of evaluation of ourselves. And in particular, we know that we need to get out more to ordinary people, to speak in schools and community centres, so that we can but that also we need to listen, that it's important to understand what it is that is confusing people. And we've also learned that we make big mistakes. So for example, in the United States, many scientists talk in degrees centigrade because that's the scientific term. But in the United States, everybody thinks in Fahrenheit. So when I say it's going to warm 4 degrees, they think it's very little because they're thinking Fahrenheit. So we have to change our language in order to better communicate.
Yeah. Yeah, LK, you wanted to finish? Yeah.
I'm finished.
You finished.
Thank you.
Just a combination of the evolution and Buddhist perspective. We often speak of reacting both from cognitive aspect and emotional aspect. So for fear of events, as Dan said at the beginning, we emotionally we fear things that are immediate. If an elephant is running here, we have great fear. If someone says an elephant will come in 10 years, nobody moves. And so that's why we need the cognitive and as a change, and cognitive comes with the deep investigation, and that's more challenging because like for ozone layer, when you tell people you cannot take bath on the beach in the summer without wearing a t-shirt because you'll be burned by UV light, then they really start to worry. So that's the dilemma, is the future doesn't hurt, not yet, but it is somehow too far away for us to be moved emotionally, so we need more of the cognitive aspect.
The climate 간다 투슈두기를 되는 초도 연구야 말be. 민망구지 가시 올라가 내배 소리지
It's true that the science of environmental degradation are not that visible, but on the other hand, it is also the fact that a lot of people do experience the effect right now in terms of their health conditions, whether difficult to breathe or some kind of other diseases that they experience.
And also, I think that because climate change will be experienced very much through extremes, that the experience of, as natural disasters start to increase, floods and droughts, then people start to believe that the climate is changing. And people who live closest to the environment they're already convinced. They can see what is happening to them. I think perhaps sometimes people who live away from nature are less aware. One of the studies Elke may know is that the people who are most aware that the climate is changing are people who have gardens, because they see the change in their gardens. So perhaps if more people were gardeners, they would be more aware of the changing climate.
Or maybe leaders should live in wilderness.
Yes.
Your Holiness, I want to just respond. When you made the analogy of when your doctor tells you you're sick, you change behavior, and following some of Elke's and Machu's comments about the difficulty in perceiving the problem, I'm actually a physician before I was trained as an environmental scientist. And I have an analogy from a physician point of view, which is that if someone comes to you and they're bleeding, and you can see the problem, and you can sew them up and treat them immediately, that's very obvious. Or if they're having a heart attack and short of breath, it's obvious. But I see the problem of global environmental change and degradation, and its direct and also indirect effects on human health and well-being as very insidious, and as Machu said, nearly invisible in many cases. And I think the analogy is like high blood pressure. When you have high blood pressure, you feel fine. But inside, it's it's harming every system in your body over a long period of time. It's called an insidious killer. And so in some regards, this problem of global ecological and global climate change will be more difficult than the success we've had in the ozone layer. Diana mentioned how we've solved that problem, or nearly solved that problem. Well, you could see the hole in the ozone by satellite, and you had a very direct impact from that environmental destruction of the layer. It causes skin cancer and eye cataracts. So we could see it. It was more simple. Climate change affects many broad things, and we'll have a more, except for heat waves possibly, many more indirect, invisible, insidious problems. So I think that's why this is so challenging and will be more difficult to reverse.
Actually, suppose this special brain of human being is to think long-term interest. Animal, okay, we can't blame. They have no intelligence. So only, you see, day by day, immediate.
No.
We have this marvelous brain. You see, we must think about after 10 years, after 100 years, after 1,000 years, maybe too long. I don't know. Eventually, the sun, you see, some serious change there, then no hope.
Well, in maybe
Maria.
Yeah. In maybe 10,000
And then
years.
it's better to just meditate impermanence. No need much worry. Yes, things always changing. It is nature.
eventually, in several thousand years, we would have another ice age.
Oh.
But I think that will be too late for us to compensate for the warming. So,
these recent sort of also the obvious serious change about the climate condition, right? Climate
conditions.
And some, as you mentioned, because of the wet
wetter areas get wetter.
More rain, unusually a lot of flood now. And then some area very dry. Now, me and the door.
So how can you make the connection between
global warming,
that
the
change with the global warming, and through that way tied to human action? So
can
what is
you
the kind
explain
of
something?
Yeah.
Now
what is the kind of causal link?
Why would global warming produce those kinds of weather extremes?
Yes. Okay. Well, there are several quite complex reasons, but one is that warmer air holds more moisture. So as the atmosphere warms, it can hold more moisture. And also, when some parts of the world warm more than others, it creates stronger winds. So what you can have is, when a storm does build up, there's just a lot more moisture to fall out of it because the air is warmer. So that's part of it, is that. But also, the great cycles of the atmosphere, where our air rises at the equator and sinks over the tropics, those become accelerated. So where it rises, you get rain and it's wetter, and then the sinking air will be stronger, in a sense, drying things out. But it's extremely complicated because we also have phenomena like the monsoon, which depend on the difference between the temperatures of the ocean and the temperatures of the Tibetan plateau. And so we're still trying to understand how those dynamics will change. But there are certain parts of the world which we're very confident, or fairly confident, that will get warmer and drier. And we're thinking of those as, in a sense, the hot spots of the planet. And they're places like Southern Africa, the Mediterranean, the part of the United States where I live. These are areas where everything points to it getting both hotter and drier. But in this part of the world, some areas, it does look as which will get wetter because of the more moisture that will be in the atmosphere.
that's our chaba university.
Yeah, it's as if the cycles just get more intense because there's more energy, because it's warmer. And so another example would be the formation of hurricanes and typhoons. Because the oceans are warmer, that heat feeds the energy of the storms. So we think that hurricanes and typhoons will become fiercer, more intense. Not necessarily more of them, but they would be stronger.
Your Holiness, I'm wondering whether it helps to think a bit about the difference between another great crisis that human beings faced. I'm sorry.
Closer.
Oh, closer. That human beings faced, which was the Second World War. You and I were both children during the Second World War. And this was a terrible time. But people thought, well, we're going to get together and we're going to fight this enemy. The problem now is that the enemy is us. And it's so much more difficult, isn't it, to fight our own tendencies and our denial, our desire to have the comfortable life that we have, than it is to fight something that's outside of ourselves. What do you think?
We do not consider we are our own enemy. No.
Yeah.
among our emotion. You see, some part is our enemy.
Yes.
One, ignorance is the enemy. So we, as a human being, as a sort of sentient being, I think positive. And therefore, it is right to survive. So that's why we are discussing. If we are really, human beings are really enemy of human being, then better to finish. Then why we are discussing seriously these things?
Exactly.
For survival of human being. So human being basically, I believe, you see, positive.
Well, one has to free that good part of us, doesn't it? I mean, there's one part of us that doesn't want to face difficult things and says it's too hard for us to do all these things. And the other part that says, no, as you're saying, we got to do it together. But it's difficult in this case because we don't see it so clearly as we did with a war. Or if the enemy is outside, you say, well, it's clear, and this is not as clear.
I think His Holiness is saying that he still feels that to a large degree it's really a question of understanding and awareness. The more we understand, the more we become aware.
We human beings have the ability, you see, to develop visions and think long future. That's the human sort of, the special sort of
quality. Quality, no?
I think special gift from God. So we must utilize that.
I agree. This is the special
if we
thing
act like
about us.
Animals,
then
there is no hope.
We are the only animals that know that we are going to die. We can only ask and think ahead, and therefore, as you say, take action so that we can live better.
That's right. That's right. We have such sort of wonderful sort of memory, and also this language. So we record, and then this the scientific sort of method. Now know about previous 100,000 years what happened. So only we human being knows. Maybe those angels may know that. But that is mysterious level. So they obviously, we have the capacity or ability to look back several centuries. And similarly, thinking about several centuries in the future. Long future. Then, you see, with that sort of knowledge, with that ability, then we have to make proper plan.
I couldn't agree with you more. The question is how to get people so that they're willing to make those proper plans, because we're not doing it right now. Why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we?
I think constant, tireless effort. Yeah. I think each year, if we increase number of people who clearly sort of also aware these things, from awareness, make some kind of sort of enthusiasm to do something. If you each year create 100,000, then 10 years, 100,000, that eventually can make effect. Like education.
Yeah,
I think when first this education started, I think very few people then go that way. Now education,
universal.
Or the whole universal.
No.
Well,
I think ecology, I often used to telling people, in previous century, I think very few people who really showing concern about ecology out of their awareness. Gradually, because of scientists now telling the seriousness about that. Myself, when I come from Tibet, 1959, no idea. Every water we feel very clean, pure, drink. In Tibet, when we
travel
months. So whenever we come across one river or stream, we enjoy. Only after I came outside Tibet, India, and when first time I heard this water you cannot drink, I feel a little surprised. That's polluted. In Tibet, no such sort of thing. So through awareness, now I really feel, the concern about environment is the question of our survival, not me, not few hundred people, but nearly 7 billion human beings' survival. So it is quite serious.
Yes. Yeah.
So through awareness, not through meditation, but through awareness from help of those scientists. So that's why I describe these as guru. And one good thing is they're open mind. The idea not fixed. Sometimes we religious people a little bit fixed. And very much sort of unbiased. Unbiased. Very good.
Scientist.
And they find this a fact. Then they accept. That's very good.
I think I teach very large classes of students, and that's one source of optimism, is how interested the students are in these issues and how concerned if I give this talk to a group of undergraduates, they immediately, what can we do? What can we do?
Good.
Which is really meaningful, and I think I should be teaching even more classes based on what you said. But I wanted to make a couple more comments. One is, scientists sometimes wish that carbon dioxide was a colored gas so that people could see it.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, it's a clear gas.
But let us see as the Nazi Jisuanda, Casa gas chamber survey. The days of this, it did not the gas to just the danger in uncomfortable group. Just a leaders did not gamma juice in the
So one possibility would be to create kind of chambers where you release these really toxic gases like carbon dioxide, and to a kind of a level which is not, not comfortable, and then expose
not level of death, but some serious uncomfortable
discomfort. So then you let the world leaders spend a few minutes in these.
But we actually did this experiment near where I live in Arizona. We have this facility called Biosphere 2, where we tried to simulate a miniature planet. And when people went into Biosphere 2 with no exchange with the outside, the carbon dioxide did go up. But one thing that happens is you start by laughing. It makes you silly, carbon dioxide, before it kills you. So it actually...
It's not going to work then.
Oh.
So that plan won't work.
Yes.
His Holiness is wondering why it causes laughter, because people are kind of happier, or?
No, I think it's...
Some physical.
It's a brain.
It's a physical. It's
some
the effect
genes
of
or
the
something.
brain.
Effect on the brain.
Neuroscientist, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Richie? We don't know.
About why CO2 makes... Oh, okay.
But it must be neurological.
Yeah, I think so.
Is it the same as the one that pregnant ladies use for giving birth? That's a
No.
that's a separate one.
Sound
But it does affect
I think
your,
the ability or function of intelligence
yes,
may be reduced.
affects your decision making.
Yeah.
But it would have to be very much higher. I think everything else would have changed before we would feel it physiologically in that way. That's at very high levels.
제 토보지 레나마도 아주 수군용의 그 돈에 마시마시라 시작하고 그랬었구나. 대인은 즉 삼당제 decision making이 안 된데 개발되고요. 그렇지? 제도 그래서
Claire.
This goes back to Sally's comments, thinking about these environmental problems being caused by the bad side of us. But one of the problems with carbon dioxide emissions is that we don't intend to produce them, and we would behave in the same ways even if we weren't producing the carbon dioxide emissions. We don't drive our cars in order to emit. It's a side effect of what we do. So it's a more complicated problem about being aware of things that we don't intend to happen, as well as things that we actually intend.
So we don't intend them, we don't see them, we don't perceive them, so it's very difficult to raise awareness.
But I do think we're acting as if nobody is concerned. But Elke and I have a friend, Tony Leiserowitz, who does surveys all over the world. And his surveys show that the majority of people are concerned about climate change. They are aware. It's not everybody, but the fact that in the United States even, with all of the politics, that the majority of people think that the world is warming and would like something to be done, it's perhaps the citizens understand it. Somehow the leaders are not responding to that understanding always.
Can I add something to this? When Al Gore released his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, there were many people who were very concerned about the problem. They came out of the movie theaters and wanted to act. So I think one other important thing we have to talk about is not just getting people's attention. When we have it, we have to tell them what to do. And the solutions are not simple. One of the reasons the ozone problem was solved, and with now actually a reduction in the ozone hole in the atmospheres, because there were simple solutions. There were 2 or 3 simple things that industry could do. They were substitute for the ozone gas. And when we can do something about a problem, then we will. When we have no simple solutions, that's when we try to deny that it's a problem, because we feel powerless.
가다 강에 등 뭐인지 강에 되게 규들 남상 뭐인지 남상 되게 독탑이야 탑신이 있을때 돈대고 잡으러서 다나 고유를 막 보시던데 즉 심슈유 내주 신도 제변에 수수 줘볼 간다서 그렇고 유면서 lap고 초질려 남샤게 마시면서 이때네 양 디기디 규르투걸 자외 미스케단 그렇고 이런 강에 지태고 보지.
We're talking a lot about climate change, but I think one of the intentions of my talk was to show that even if we solve climate change, there are many other problems that we have to learn how to manage them all together. So for many scientists, the risk of biodiversity loss or of the problem of
meaning species die.
Yeah, the species extinction. That we've almost become so focused on climate change that we've forgotten these other thresholds. And part of the point of the planetary boundaries was to remind us that we need to be focused on all of these very, very serious problems. And sometimes it seems as though we've moved the agenda to only worry about climate change. So the problem of water, the problem of species extinction, the problem of pollution, we have to manage all of those together. But I think, as we'll hear, they do, in some cases, always have similar roots in human consumption of resources. But from a scientific point of view, it's almost the multiple stresses that we're concerned about. What happens when climate interacts with deforestation, interacts with water scarcity? How do we give guidance on all of those stresses together?
Holistic.
So you need a holistic approach.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And one affects the other. So biodiversity loss and forest loss is affecting climate and vice versa. But we need to have international action on all of those. And you mentioned the UN, Your Holiness. The UN has conventions on climate, but on many of these other, and on oceans, but on many of these other areas, we still haven't even got the US to take a position. But for example, with biodiversity loss, with species extinction, there are now new international conventions and also scientific collaborations to try to understand what's happening.
If I may ask a question, we heard the notion that perhaps it's very important to have something to do, so to speak. The science tells us a lot about the dangers. We have a case of a successful intervention in the context of ozone. What's the next one that might be like ozone? What's the most promising area in which advancement could be made quickly even? Because of course, the more successful cases we can demonstrate, the more good news we have, probably the more people will be willing to really accept and look more carefully and gain the knowledge necessary to reverse some of this environmental degradation. So is there an area that's the most promising, or is it all hopeless?
It's not all hopeless, but I was trying to think of those boundaries, which ones. I think perhaps the loss of forests, that we really are starting to tackle that, both through the amount of protected area. I mean, Mathieu was talking about Bhutan, but many countries are making very serious efforts to protect their forests, like Brazil, for example. Even Indonesia, which had very serious loss of forest, is now taking that seriously. So I think the combination of a commitment to protect forests and then investment in allowing more food to be produced on the same land. And that doesn't necessarily mean plant breeding. It can just mean reducing losses and pests, or helping farmers just get a little bit more yield. And so I think perhaps the forest boundary might be the one that would be relatively easy to solve. And it's something that a lot of individuals are already taking action on. I don't know perhaps if other people have a boundary that they're more optimistic about, but that's my second choice.
Your Holiness. So I think, you know, what Diana was talking about earlier, that there are actually individuals who are actually very concerned about climate change. There is a program called Earth Hour, where 1/5 of the world actually is participating. They switch the lights off for 1 hour in a year to demonstrate their concern about climate change. Some of our monasteries actually participate in it too. So at the individual level, the concern is there. The challenge is at the institutional level, because there are so many reasons at an institutional level why nobody wants to change. So you look at the oil mining and gas industry, you look at the development pattern that exists, and in many ways it seems as though we are being given only one blueprint for economic growth. So the challenge really is, how do we make sustainability a norm, a social norm? And the individuals are already there, so how do we engage the institutions? My own hope is actually that religion will play a very big role. I think, especially, I live in the United States, most people really want to live the good life. And that means you want more and more and more things for yourself. So how do we bring sustainability into this way of thinking? It seems to me that the only area where we naturally embrace sacrifice is religion, where you fast because you want to evolve spiritually, or you take on robes and vows because you want to enlighten other living beings. So if religion can actually come together and institutionally start transforming other institutional minds, maybe there is great hope there.
Sure. His
Holiness feels it's difficult.
those people who are really serious about their own religious faith, of course, these people, because of the implementing what they believe. But that quite limited. I often expressing, for example, in this country, India, comparatively, people are more religious-minded, but equally, a lot of corrupted people there. Even these supposed to be religious follower, believer, but no hesitation involve corruption. So that's a clear sign. They are not serious about their religious faith. Once you should believe God or Buddha or Vishnu or these things, you must act honestly. So the common sort of message or practice of all religion is justice, honest, truthful. Then, difficult. So my only hope is through sort of education, Then perhaps I think Mithu mentioned Bhutan, and you also visited there. So it's some smaller country, and also seems to like some Baltic state, small. Perhaps some just develop new lifestyle. Recently, I was in Estonia. I mentioned in the capital, as usually I get up in early morning, so around dawn or around 4, 5, on the street, no car. Few people walking or some cycling. So I expressed there, your lifestyle, this is, I think, something very good, must preserve. In New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, almost 24 hours car, always there. That lifestyle, actually unrealistic. Meantime, on this global level, there are a lot of poor people, like India and China, a lot of poor people. That immoral. We must, because the uplift, you see, their living standard. So if these people, eventually, I think over 2 billion human beings, combination China and India, almost nearly 3 billion children, 3 billion. So 3 billion cars, impossible. We cannot say, oh, we richer people, we have special right to use these things, you should remain poor. We cannot say that. So we must reduce this gap, rich and poor. Then the reality, the Western sort of the American lifestyle, impossible to copy rest of the world. So it's some smaller nation, I think the lifestyle, something, and the economy, sustainable economy, and meantime, everybody equal, happy, more sort of justice society.
Equitable. More equitable.
Then gradually, some other nations may follow. And together, what do you think?
In the break, I was mentioning to His Holiness that we just went with Jonathan and Richie and Susan to Bhutan, and we met the environment minister, and he said that now more than half of the country is natural park, 80% of is natural land, and it increased more over 20 years ago. In 5 years, they're going to completely phase out pesticides and fertilizers, so 100% organic, and there'll be zero carbon in 10 years. So that's an example of a country, but there are also cities. I just read something about Portland in Oregon, where there's 20% less cars. They grow organic garden within the parks and the cities. And so there's also citizens' effort that share an enthusiasm. So it can come also at the level of communities, and then other cities look at that, and even government is not very reactive. But just to add on what Jonas was saying about greed and corruption, the problem is greed and corruption needs immediate satisfaction. You don't want greed for 100 years. So in the United States, as you know better than me, most of those who finance campaign to make people believe that there's no climate change are those immediately involved in reaping benefit from the oil industries and all that. So they give millions and millions for that. And so that's also one of the problems. And that has to do also about the holistic view. There have been a social psychologist called Tim Kasser. He studied how much people are inclined to consumption, to consumerism. And he studied tens of thousands of people over 20 years. And what he found is people who are higher wish to consume more and more, who place more value in possessions, in name, in reputation, in having nice cars and so forth, they are much less concerned about holistic values. They don't care much about the environment. They're only looking for immediate pleasures. And somehow they have less friends, they have worse health. So in fact, they place too much values and hopes and fears outside themselves, and they don't have enough of intrinsic values. So that's interesting studies, because again, it's not about ethics. In conclusion, it's saying, no, I'm not giving you lessons, but if you want to be happy, to have many friends, to be in good health, and concerned about the whole thing, just live it more, have a voluntary simplicity.
No.
Yes, I think the question of India and China and people's aspirations for a motor vehicle or for other consumer items, I feel as though there's a question here about supposing we had a car that was all electric and used solar energy, would we then find that acceptable? So is it that we want to find ways for people to, is it okay for people to consume more if it doesn't damage the environment? That's the contradiction, because as Gregory will discuss tomorrow, there are ways to calculate the impact of different consumer goods, and maybe if that consumer good is low impact, does that make it acceptable? So I think that's one of the questions I have, because I know from my work in Latin America that for some people a car really is a better life. They can get to the hospital faster, they can take their children to school. So I think there are some very interesting questions there. And you've given me an idea with your Bhutan example, Mathieu and Jonathan, that we should do a paper on how Bhutan is staying within the planetary boundaries of an example of how you do that.
Jonathan.
Yes, just to follow up, Your Holiness, about the change in cities and talking about the automobile, which I'll be speaking to a little bit this afternoon. Sometimes it's not so good to have an automobile, especially in a big traffic jam. And the city in Colombia, Bogota, Colombia, a developing country, came to a point maybe 10 years ago when they had so much traffic that they didn't have enough capacity, and it was awful. And the Mayor Peñalosa of Bogota was faced with a decision to either build more roads and highways or to take a cheaper route and to develop a bus train, take one lane away from the highway and turn it into a train. It's called Transmilia, a bus train, and a full system of better mass transportation and bicycle roads, bicycle paths. And this is a case study in a developing country where they actually made a decision to get away from the automobile. And there are now follow-up studies to see if the population is happier and healthier. We don't know the answer, but there are, as Machu said, some great positive developments across cities around the country. Chicago is one city that's very green, and building green roofs, living roofs, where on the one hand you, with vegetation on top of the building, you have less heat intensity. You also control all the rain, so you don't have rain and flooding and contamination. And so you've got multiple benefits from some of these interventions. So at the local level, there are some positive developments around the world.
So it shows that there are things that can be done.
As I mentioned earlier, the Estonia, from early morning, I noticed some cause of the
City bus.
City bus, there, no private
cars.
And then, of course, daytime increasing, but so this so I really very much so impressed. So on my occasion there, I used to talk. I also mentioned, you see, of course, I do not know the detail, but just this observation, few days observation, so I very much impressed. Then I told them that, of course, a smaller country, less population, so can manageable. Yes, as you mentioned, these things are really because of the encouraging. You can do. For granted.
So one of the big problems is that often people just take things for granted. What is the current situation, the status quo, and they just take it for granted, and without knowing the alternative.
So obviously, you see the more car, luxury cars, luxury house, and looks very, very pleasant,
attractive.
Then ones know the long-term consequences. 100,000 car, 100 million car, like that. Then at least there's some question to grow.
Yes, once you start thinking along those lines, and then there will be questions in your mind.
Just to follow up that very nice comment, getting back to what Elke said, it's a matter of changing the norms.
Ooh, sorry, that was me.
Okay. That means I should stop speaking, right?
No. Please continue. My apologies.
Just find that we need to change the norms. The norms right now are when you get richer, you get a car, and it's status. But the norm could be, as you get wealthier and advance, you actually live close to a train or able to bicycle. So we have to change the mental norm.
That's right.
So often what we do is we only use the kind of material measurements of kind of a standard or quality of life, but we do not bring into the equation one's own internal sense of well-being, mental well-being.
Quite often, among very rich sort of people, when we start talk at the beginning, more sort of nice words, then become more sort of closer. There are a lot of complaints. So actually, that person, very wealthy person, maybe billionaire, but very unhappy person. It's fact.
It's true.
Then those people who materially may not be very rich,
affluent,
but very happy family, full of trust, full of friendship, wonderful. more money, more power, I think more suspicion, more distrust, more jealousy. So nobody sort of pay attention to these things.
I think
We're at our last minute.
yeah, it's a last remark actually. People sometimes ask me how I can keep doing this science because it seems to have such depressing outcomes. But actually being a scientist makes me happy because it's so fascinating. Even though these things we're studying are very worrying, they're so interesting and intriguing that it's a very happy life to be a scientist,
right.
I think.
And on that note, we need to wrap up the morning because of time. But we've hit many of the themes that will continue through the week. It's been a very rich morning discussion. We've had some bad news and some good news, some very good news. We've talked about the ethical dimension and the dilemma of what leads to action. Is awareness enough? We will continue these issues, explore them more deeply as the week continues. Thank you, Your Holiness.
Thank you. Thank
Wonderful.
you very much. Thank you.
I'd like to, on behalf of Mind and Life, as a moderator and board member, to welcome everyone here, the Mind and Life family and our Tibetan friends, and I particularly want to acknowledge the monks who have come from monasteries all over India, and of course we'll have a special session at the end of each day for questions and clarifications and debate and so on with the monks. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mind and Life, this is an unusual organization. It was founded by two visionaries, Francisco Varela, the late Francisco Varela, who was an amazing cognitive neuroscientist, very visionary, and a visionary businessman, Adam Engel. It started as a series of small dialogues and has grown now to really flourish into programs for graduate students and fellowships, and please read about it in the brochure. I first came to Mind and Life in 1989. It was the second meeting. This is the 23rd now. And in the second meeting was in Newport Beach. You may remember because just at that time you won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I remember very well the press conference that you had for the Peace Prize, and the first question that was asked, which was, how do you feel winning the Peace Prize? And your answer has stayed with me to this day. It was, I feel very happy for my friends who wanted me to win the prize. That was when I first got the understanding that you were a very unusual person. I also later came to...
Yes.
And later, of course, I came to understand that that was an expression of mudita, altruistic joy, taking pleasure in the joy of happiness of other people. I would like to ask...
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, Your Holiness, would you care to welcome people on your behalf?
당의 인지 창조의 점은 창조 근처에 경례 예배. Once more, we have this gathering. And number of you, we're quite familiar. And then also new faces also are here. Most welcome. I think last year in Delhi, after my sort of interview, I think CNN or something, I mentioned I'm looking forward to complete retirement. Then you express, then what will happen? This kind of meeting, if you retired. Then I told him, don't worry. As far as political responsibility is concerned, I have decided now retire. Not only because of myself retire, but almost 4-century-old tradition the Dalai Lama institution is both head of the find out the reality and its effect, its causes, like that. Then next, then the implication, right?
The ethical implications.
For our well-being. So the ethical is what share So the when you using the chance ecology yes, I think science will do the way. And interdependence, philosophical view, but very much sort of the, and that also is a way to explain the reality. Things exist due to another factor. So that's the basis of concept of interdependency. Here also is no idea of good or bad, just the reality. So that's just I felt like that.
Okay.
So now the next few days, because of our discussion will be because of the serious discussion, and then eventually we can share with more people who have some interest in this respect, in this field. And also our responsibility to create more interest in other people's mind.
Exactly.
So here now ethics, everybody agree, a lot of problem here on this planet. Every morning when I listen BBC, some problem, some killing here and there. And recently in England, some unrest has happened there. I'm really shocked. Here's among group, some Englishmen, no English.
Any British do
Oh, you?
Ram British.
Correct.
Ajala British.
British way. So I really see shocked, surprised, because say I had this sort of impression, Britisher, the old colonialist or imperialist, become very mature. The several occasions when I visit, England, the police hardly,
Visible, not very visible. Presence of police.
People generally self-disciplined. That kind of my impression. So I said something happened, and I really surprised. In any way, so the problem. And just this morning, BBC, some interview, because of flood victim in Pakistan. And consulta because Raja Jorba, Rajans. The new Dangomersu. That do not question shared words.
His Holiness heard on the BBC news broadcast that the aid workers who are helping the victims of the floods, and they're running out of money, and they're going to run out within a week or so.
Very sad. Colour and spirituality. And that I happily, voluntarily, proudly ended. But other sort of my commitment, this kind of a meeting is part of my sort of commitment regarding promotion of human value. So now it proved to you my retirement.
No doubt, no doubt.
No effect by this kind of commitment. So then I must say, so many years, number of people, including Adam Samare, really work hard. So I, and you also. so many other, I think right from the beginning. So I want to thank. Then, of course, there's some participant, like Verala, no longer with us. But their wish and their spirit, we still continuously carry. So that's the way Buddha Shakyamuni came, 2,600 years past, but his spirit still carrying, like other great sort of masters. So those, I think, people who have real vision, they are physical no longer with us, but their spirit, their vision, our responsibility to carry continuously. So I very much appreciate. Then just ecology, ethics, and interdependence. Come on. Ethics, I doubt whether direct link with this kind of our sort of the research work. We are really the scientific way to find out the reality. No concept of right or wrong or positive or negative. Then next, after finding the fact, then the next, yes, now the question of implication. What value? So like at the first, sort of just research how much effect with warm-heartedness. Simply, trying to find out the reality. What effect about anger, fear, suspicion, distrust? When we investigate these things, we have no idea anger is bad or compassion is good. No, simply try to. Some are very, very. I think the Rinpoche's ultimate Guruji, like Miller Rebbe, wonderful teacher, isn't it? But some of his followers, not quite because of the luxuries.
Luxurious.
Okay, now okay, too much.
Thank you so much for those words, Your Holiness. It's a wonderful beginning for what I think will be a very rich meeting. As you know, this is a quite unusual forum. Here we have an integrative, collaborative dialogue between science, spiritual traditions, and the humanities, philosophy, and so on. Quite unusual. And we're going to use these multiple perspectives to address the current environmental crisis. This is a very unusual topic, as you know, for Mind and Life. Out of 23 meetings, I think only 2, this is the second one, have addressed the life side of Mind and Life. But we felt that because, as you'll hear from the scientists today, there's both sad and bad news today, and also and this week, and some very hopeful news. But at the beginning, we're going to make the scientific case that as a species, we're engaged in what amounts to a slow motion suicide if we continue the way we are now. And it's because of the urgency and the moral importance of that that we felt this was a compelling topic for Mind and Life meeting. You, in your talks, often cite the love of a mother for her child as the basis for compassion. But we're facing a real paradox, and that is that even though we love our children as much as anyone has in human history, each of us unwittingly acts in ways daily that are creating a future for this planet and for our own children and their children, which will be much, much worse. The problem is this. You're going to hear a phrase that's very important. It's the Anthropocene age. Anthropocene what is Anthropocene?
Human
cause. Yeah. Diana will go into it in more detail, but basically it's geological history goes over millions of years. But in the last few hundred, we've entered a unique time in history. It's the first time the actions of one species are altering the planetary systems that support life itself in a negative way. That's the slow motion suicide. And basically we confront the dilemma that we have an urgent, compelling need to save us from our worst enemy, which is ourselves. And I feel that Buddhism and Christian theology and philosophy and psychology all have very important perspectives to offer science. Science documents what's happening, but doesn't have within it necessarily the mechanism to mobilize people to act in a skillful way. So that's the particular aspect of reality or truth we're seeking to explore over the course of the week. The problem from a point of view of evolutionary psychology is this. Our brains were formed over several 100,000 years, and the alarm system in the brain.
So then further you see, investigate why such things happen. Of course, major disaster beyond our control, but some kind of preparation by the concerned people, and people, general public living standard a bit higher. And this, I think, certainly can be less suffering. So here now is my point is corruption. All these sort of problems, I think corruption really made because of the serious effect in Africa and many areas. So now corruption almost like has a new disease cancer disease of the whole planet, whole humanity. What is wrong? Not due to lack of sort of the judiciary system, or lack of sort of police force, or lack of sort of government sort of organization, but ultimately due to lack of ethics here, lack of self-discipline. Self-discipline entirely based on ethics. I had the opportunity to explore other, as a cheating other, but I'm a human being. I should not do that, isn't it? Even your own sort of the reputation.
For your own well-being.
So ultimately we also have the responsibility to make awareness. The many problems which we are facing is ultimately the lack of the inner discipline, moral ethics. So now the way to promote moral ethics based on religion, the religions, including Buddhism, last 1,000 years existed there but failed. So now we must find ways, means, is to make convincing way.
Conviction in others.
Conviction others. The ethics, your own interest, your own health, sort of, because of that.
Well-being.
Health well-being, family well-being, like that, isn't it? So that is main sort of the main aim. So we have some sort of addition, we have some sort of moral responsibility to make known more people like that. So I really appreciate all participants, particularly all the scientists. And because of Riki Samare. Richie, I think you made, I think, great sort of contribution. John contribution at us has one of the page of share.
Yes,
Korangimi, Hudabadagmi, that they single land, charity, the Kurdish Tanguarjush. The
contribution that Richie you have made with such motivation is something that I feel that I ought to not only acknowledge but also repay your kindness.
Well, meantime, humble. That's very good. That I like. If good scientists were too much proud, I may not develop respect. Isn't it? Even religious leaders.